Kicking off the list at number 10, rocket roulette. Okay, remember May 2021, like not that long ago at all, when a large piece of space junk was about to crash land somewhere on Earth and we had no idea where it was gonna hit? Well, where did it land? At the time, this was one of the biggest pieces of human-made space junk to ever crash towards Earth. They said it would land in New York or New Zealand. Okay, that's not concerning at all. The debris came from the Long March 5B rocket and it landed in the Indian Ocean, with most of it burning up upon re-entry. Usually when rockets discard pieces, it's done so strategically, falling into the ocean, normally the Atlantic. This was not supposed to happen. Thankfully it didn't land in New York. It would have been an Avengers level threat. Imagine if that happened. Oh my god, that'd be so scary. Number 9, Hodge's meteorite. These happen pretty often, but luckily most of the time it doesn't wipe out everybody or everything. Sorry dinosaurs, but you took one for the team. Thanks. Back in 1954, residents in Talladega County, Alabama, noticed a ball of fire heading towards them. See, we didn't have Twitter back then. We couldn't warn people that a meteor was maybe gonna wipe us out. We also didn't really know how to tell if meteorites were coming back then, with technology being a little, old. So it was alarming, especially for Anne Elizabeth Hodges, who got hit by that space rock. Yeah, she got hit by a meteorite. I can't even get hit by a paintball without complaining and taking the day off work, let alone a space rock. That's insane. You may be asking, was she outside doing Pilates? Was she stargazing? Nope, she was napping in her living room and an 8-pound chunk of meteorite smashed through her roof and then grazed her hip. She got hit by a space rock and received just a bruise. First human to ever get hit by a meteorite. What a flex. Number 8, iguanas. Okay, we're dipping into the weird side of this list. Here we go. Back in 2018, Florida got another odd headline. This time it was frozen iguanas falling from the skies. They got hit with their biggest snowfall in 28 years, so these cold-blooded dudes started falling from suburban tree branches. People were just walking to get groceries, trying to, make it through this harsh winter, and iguanas are freezing and falling off trees in front of them. There's just like 4 lying in a backyard. The crazy thing is they're not dead, they're actually just paralyzed. So they come back to life later. Officials were calling for residents to not touch them or pick them up. Like, hey, sorry I can't make it, there's a frozen iguana sleeping on my car. Yeah, I'll see you tomorrow, I gotta wait this one out. Number 7, golf balls. Heading over to Florida yet again. September 1st, 1969, nice. A rainstorm started to turn heads. Sometimes large hail is described as a golf ball, right? It's golf ball sized hail. Well, this time it was actually raining golf balls. Literally. Dozens of golf balls fell from the sky and we never really figured out where they came from. Of course, being Florida, there's many golf courses around, but none of them could claim the golf balls. So the most realistic explanation is that a local pond had these piled up over time, then this storm, this water spout came through, sucked up everything, and then just hucked golf balls around town. Florida's western Gulf Coast, more like Florida's western Gulf Coast, am I right? I'll walk my way out, that's fine. Number 6, a massive meteorite. Getting a bit more cosmic in our list again, we have the Jinlin meteorite. This week, NASA launched a $330 million mission just to see if they can successfully knock an asteroid off its course. It's not heading for Earth, just to be clear, they just want to test this out. So something for sure is coming, that's what I'm gathering here. This is a huge test for just, we'll see what happens, just some space pool. Back in 1766, a meteorite did hit Earth. It pierced through China's northeast sky, and then it exploded, broke apart into a few pieces, and hit the ground. The largest piece is now on display in the Jinlin Meteorite Museum in Jinlin City. It's called Meteorite 1. It's massive. Number 5, mud. Mud spas are so hot right now. Exfoliates your dead skin cells, prevents eczema, relieves arthritis pain. Some decent benefits there. But when you don't know you're about to be covered in mud and then you're absolutely covered in mud, it can be jarring. Back in 1902, dust clouds in Illinois were so bad that when they were blown over to New York or New Jersey, the storm there turned that dust into mud. So for just a few minutes only, thankfully, mud rained down all over poor civilians. The event was hilariously described. People were outside wearing their old-timey 1902 outfits, and then they got drenched in mud out of nowhere. Clothes hanging out to dry, absolutely wrecked. The mud storm went for 40 miles, mucking up everyone and everything in its path. I just know there was an outdoor wedding during this and no one wants to talk about it. Number 4, boiled bats. This is some Tim Burton level shit right here. I felt sick writing this, I'm not gonna lie. Sorry, bat lovers. January 2018, hundreds of bats started falling from the skies and trees. They were falling all over Australia, Campbelltown. See, there was a brutal heat wave happening, so these bats, a species called Pteropus poliocephalus, they're normally good with heat. They can handle 30 degrees Celsius, then anything over that, their brains start to get all loopy. The colony manager for the Campbelltown bats made a statement about the apocalyptic site, saying that they basically boiled on the inside. There were about 200 dead bats found that day, and honestly, I couldn't imagine seeing that. At least those iguanas from Florida came back to life. these poor things just stayed dead. Number 3. Spiders. I've been talking about spiders lately on this channel, so I figured I would tell you the worst spider story that I've ever read. Australia 2015, again, Australia, back on its bullshit. Millions of tiny spiders started to fall from the sky. This phenomenon is called spider rain or angel hair. I like spider rain more, to be honest. It kind of gets to the punch quicker. Angel hair, that's something I want to check out. Absolutely not. Don't go outside when this happens. These showers happen when millions of spiders all balloon at the same time, depending on the season. So they climb trees, then they stick their ass out, and then they parachute across town onto your lap. You can't see them because they're tiny and there's millions of them and they're flying above us, but they're happening all the time. Sometimes these guys land in heavily populated areas, and let me tell you, if I was vacationing in Australia and it began to rain spiders, I would write a formal complaint. I would be upset. No, it's even more gross than that. Number 2, beef. Yep, flakes of beef were falling from the sky. That's so gross. How, Taylor? Tell us how this happened. Well, 1876, there was a small window where a field in Bath County, Kentucky got a meat storm. Yeah, we're gonna call it a meat storm. That sounds perfect for what it is, honestly. They have no idea where this came from still today, or if it was even meat. That's pretty gross. They had 3 dudes just stand outside like with their tongue out like it's a winter wonderland, and they couldn't decide if it was bear meat. They thought it might have been buzzard barf or bacteria from jellyfish that made its way into town and into the air. If you ever think it's raining meat, don't eat it. The Kentucky meat shower is still a mystery, and you know what? Let's not solve it. I'm good with that. Finally, number 1, treasure. The best for last, and you know what? I didn't make it fucking disgusting. You're welcome. Back in June 1940, the Russian villain of Meschera had a lucky rainfall. Coins from the 16th century began raining down. What a scene. Sometimes it rains iguanas that are frozen, other times it's literal treasure. It came from an undisclosed treasure trove that was buried close by, and a storm lifted the newly exposed treasure into the sky. Thank you, soil erosion. Imagine getting hit with a 16th century coin. That would for sure leave a mark. You'd have to pay your medical bills by using the coin that hit you. Full circle, that would be nuts.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the telephone cats. Sorry to all the cat people out there, this one is not going to be for you. In 1929, 2 scientists at Princeton University wanted to conduct an experiment in order to test how auditory nerves perceive sound. This is obviously extremely important research, but the way they went about it is truly messed up. They took a sedated but alive cat and cut out parts of its brain. They then attached one end of a telephone wire to the cat's auditory nerve and then the other end to a receiver. When one of these scientists spoke into the cat's ear, the other one could hear it on the other end. This is very cool, but most definitely not an excuse to do something so inhumane. There were benefits of this experiment, of course, and it is believed that this may have helped lead to the development of cochlear implants, which is of course an incredibly important scientific advancement. The worst part, however, while the cat actually survived this experiment, instead of treating it like a king for the rest of its life, like it truly deserved, these scientists instead killed it just to see if the experiment would still work on a dead cat. It didn't. In our number 9 spot today, we have Bobby, Eddie, and David. When Bobby Shafran was just 19 years old, he found out he had a twin, a brother named Eddie. The 2 men were raised separately because they had been adopted at birth into different households. Not too long after finding out about each other, things took an even crazier twist when Bobby and Eddie found out that they had a triplet, another brother named David. What should have been a very joyous reunion for the triplets turned very dark when they began to uncover the truth about what happened and why they had spent all those years not knowing the others existed. As it turns out, they found out that they were forced to be subjects in an experiment that they had no idea was taking place. Peter Neubauer was a child psychiatrist who wanted to study nature versus nurture, but decided to do it in the most cruel and unethical way. He believed that twins or triplets had a better chance of thriving if they were separated from their twin, and wanted to prove this by unknowingly separating twins from each other at birth. Luckily, Bobby, Eddie, and David all found each other, and their story is documented in the movie 3 Identical Strangers. In our number 8 spot today, we have isolation. In the 1950s, Donald Hebb, who was a professor of psychology at McGill University in Montreal, began a study to see how sensory isolation affects humans. He gave male graduate students $20 a day to stay in small rooms with basically only a bed in them. They had little human contact, only when being given food and when being led to the bathrooms. They also took it a step further and had U-shaped pillows to cover their ears to block out noise, as well as gloves to limit their sense of touch. Every person in the experiment experiment said that they found their thinking and thought processes were affected as they couldn't focus on any one thing. Before long, the participants began having intense auditory and visual hallucinations. The plan was to observe them for 6 weeks to see how they were impacted, but none of them lasted more than just a few days. Every participant was far too distraught after only a few days from the experiment to continue on for any longer. It is crazy how quickly this all began to happen, but I'm glad that they got them all out of there and stopped the research right there. In our number 7 spot today, we have the CRISPR babies. This is probably the most well-known case of human genetic engineering, and probably not for the right reasons. On November 25th, 2018, He Jiankui, who was a biophysics researcher, announced here on YouTube that his team had successfully created the world's first genome-edited babies. These babies, Lulu and Nana, were born from genetically modified embryos that had been made to be resistant to HIV. Here's the thing, no one is arguing about whether or not this could potentially be an amazing thing for people. Of course, if it works, this is a monumental scientific advancement. The argument is about whether or not it is ethically correct to genetically modify a human before they're really even able to be a human yet, especially when the potential risks and long-term effects of this kind were completely unknown. Again, it's not about what this is aiming to do, it just boils down to a lack of consent, especially on something that could have been lethal in the worst case scenario. This study also was conducted without the public discussion of the scientific community, which again is the source of quite a bit of controversy. In the end, he ended up being sentenced to jail time as well as being forced to pay a fine. 2 others he worked alongside were also found guilty for having, quote, forged ethical review documents and misled doctors into unknowingly implanting gene-edited embryos into 2 women. At the end of the day, scientific advancements are very cool and very exciting and very important, but not at the cost of doing the right thing the right way. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Stanford Prison Experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment is one of the most famous examples of a sort of experiment gone wrong situation. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it started on August 14th, 1971, and it was led by university psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. The experiment took student volunteers and divided them into 2 groups, one group of prisoners and one group of guards, and they placed all the volunteers into a fake prison that was created for the experiment. The experiment aimed to see if and how quickly humans would turn evil under the right conditions and with the right amount of power. Basically, it was a test to try and answer the question of if humans are inherently good or inherently evil. I think everyone was shocked with the result. After just 6 days, the experiment needed to be concluded because the guards began absolutely tormenting the prisoners. It really showed the kinds of things humans can be capable of even after such a short time. In our number 5 spot today, we have Masha and Dasha Kryoslyapova. Masha and Dasha were conjoined twins who were taken from their mother and were subjected to a series of horrible medical experiments. Because of the fact that they shared a blood system but had separate nervous systems, they were ideal candidates for this research, although they certainly never should have been forced into it at all. Some things they did to the twins was force them into staying awake and seeing their reactions to sleep deprivation. They starved them at some points and even burnt and froze them to see what would happen during these intense temperature changes. They would poke one twin with needles to see if it affected the other one, and submerge one into ice cold water and check the temperature of the other twin. The twins spent the rest of their lives having a pretty toxic dynamic, I'm sure in part due to the trauma they shared together as a result of these terrible experiments. The twins passed away in 2003 at the age of 53, and they were the oldest living conjoined twins at the time of their passing. In our number 4 spot today, we have the undead. Alright, we had one that was bad for the cat lovers, and this time, I'm sorry dog lovers, but this one isn't gonna be up your alley. If you've seen The Walking Dead, or really any zombie anything, you'll wonder why anyone was ever conducting this experiment at all. A team of Russian scientists released a video in which they showed a few dog heads that were being kept alive by an artificial blood circulation system. In the video, scientists used a heart-lung machine and were able to show the dog heads responding to sound. They would wiggle their ears, blink their eyes, and sometimes they were even able to lick their mouths. In 2005, for some reason, American scientists began trying to recreate this horrifying experiment. They flushed out all of the blood from a dog and replaced it with oxygen and sugar saline. Just 3 hours after this, and after a blood transfusion and an electric shock, the dog was somehow brought back from the dead. I truly wish I knew the purpose of this experiment, but I think I mostly just wish it never occurred at all. In our number 3 spot today, we have Britches. Britches is a perfect example of a horrifying experiment done on an animal for human gain. Basically, researchers wanted to test out brain-implanted sonar devices bridges in an attempt to create something that would be an asset to people without sight. There have been people without sight in the past, and I'm sure also the present, who've been able to develop a sort of like echolocation type skill where by clicking their tongue or making other sounds, they're able to map out their surroundings. Such a cool thing, and having a scientific advancement or the technology to help with this process should be an amazing thing, and it definitely is, until this experiment takes a very dark turn, and this is where Britches comes in. Britches was a monkey who did have his sight, but in order to test the efficacy of this device, they needed a monkey without sight. Instead of finding a monkey without sight, which has to exist somewhere, they just took Britches away, and they did this by sewing his perfectly healthy eyes shut. This experiment was undoubtedly helpful in the scientific process, but it should never be at this kind of cost. It is pretty clear that Britches most definitely did not deserve that kind of treatment at all. In our number 2 spot today, we have THN 1412. In 2007, there began the trial of a newer drug called THN 1412 that was intended to be used to treat leukemia. It is normal for a new drug to have gone through an animal testing phase prior to being tested on humans, and this one was no different. This drug had only been tested in animals prior to this, but the animal trials were very successful, so it was dubbed safe to begin testing in human trials. To start off with, the humans were first given a dose that was 500 times lower than the dose that was given to animals, just to play things as safe as possible. Unfortunately, however, although they did take every step they could and truly were being as safe as they could, these precautions did not seem to be enough, as this that had undergone all of the necessary pre-trial steps ended up being catastrophic once humans became involved. This drug began to cause organ failure in those who had even had a tiny dose of it. I'm not sure if there would have been a way to know this prior to this terrible event, or if this is just one of those terrible caveats to the trial testing process, but this is truly a horrifying outcome that I don't think anyone intended. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. In the years between 1932 and 1972, there were 399 black impoverished farmers in Tuskegee, Alabama, who all had syphilis, who were recruited to participate in a free program. They were told that the program would help them treat their ailment, but of course, that never happened. The experiment was conducted by people who were trying to see what would happen if the disease went untreated. Instead of treating the men with penicillin, which was the recommended treatment at the time, the men received aspirin and mineral supplements as placebos. And while this experiment was conducted to try and understand what effect the spread of the disease had on the body, the unethical considerations of the scientists who conducted it proved to be absolutely fatal and just downright cruel. Out of the 399, 28 of them passed away from the disease directly, 100 passed away from complications related to the disease, 40 spouses became infected, which was then passed on to 19 others at birth whose parents had been infected. This whole situation truly is one of those times where you stop and wonder how these things were ever treated as acceptable, and really hope that things have changed for good.
Number 10. Click, click, slide. One night in a small town not too far from where you are now, a woman, Sally, was late to pick up her daughter from a school basketball game. The reason she was late was because she'd stopped to get a manicure and long new acrylic nails put on at the salon. While she was rushing to the school, her car stalled out on the train tracks, and suddenly she saw a bright light and heard the train's horn as it collided with her car. The car was destroyed, and the only piece of her body that was found were her legs. The whole town was abuzz the next day with the mystery of what had happened, but at 6:30, the same time the train killed Sally, all of the young people in the town heard 3 strange noises. Click, click, slide, over and over again. It seemed to move all the way from one side of town to the other, from the train tracks to the school. Originally, people were wary of what was going on, so they walked together in groups, but every night they heard it. Click, click, slide. And after a while, the townspeople were terrified, and no one went outside alone after dark, especially if you weren't a grown-up. One night, young Emma was sitting in her living room with her mother when her mom asked her, "Emma, I haven't been feeling well. Would you go to the store and pick up some medicine for me?" Emma looked worried and said, "But Mom, it's almost 6:30. And her mother shrugged it off, saying it's just an old story and that she needed to grow up. So off Emma went to the store, but on her way back, as night fell, sure enough she heard the noise. Click, click, slide, click, click, slide, and she looked behind her but saw nothing. She quickened her pace as she walked home, and behind her, getting louder, click, click, slide. And as she got closer to home, the sounds were practically in her ear. Click, click, slide. And as she reached her front door, she turned around to see the mangled torso of a woman dragging herself with her long nails along the ground towards her. Click, click, slide. Emma pounded on the door and begged to be let inside, but her mother had locked the door and fallen asleep. And behind her, louder than ever, she heard click, click, slide. The next morning, the mother couldn't find Emma, and when she opened the front door to look for her, all that she saw was a trail of blood going down the stairs, and a message scrawled in blood on the front steps that read, "Why didn't you open the door, mother?" I can already imagine the special effects makeup on Sally. Number 9. The Keyhole. Our next tale is a bit more simple and would be some slow build horror for sure, but some of my favorite scary movies are like that. A man comes into town on business. All of the hotels in the area are booked up for the holidays, so he decides to check into a less than savory hotel, as it's the only one with a vacancy sign on. When the front desk worker gives him his key, she says that on his floor there is a locked room with no number on it, and that he must stay out of it at all costs. Agreeing, he heads to his room, and as he does, he walks by the room with no number. He almost knocks, but decides against it and goes to bed. The next night, as he's returning to his room, he walks by the door and sees that the keyhole is rather wide, as though the lock was from a very long time ago. And he crouches down and looks inside. He sees a room much like his own, but in the back corner, there's a woman with skin as white as snow, crying with her head against the wall. He almost knocks, but decides against it. The next night, the man decides to look through the keyhole one more time to check on the woman, but all he sees when he looks through is the color red. She must have blocked the door with a red scarf or tape or something, he thinks to himself. When he checks out, he confesses to the front desk worker that he'd looked through the keyhole into the room. She sighs and tells him that they don't rent the room anymore because a man murdered his wife in there many years ago, and when the police found her body, she'd been strangled and beaten so hard that her eyes had filled with blood, and they turned completely red. Number 8. The King of Hearts. Modern playing cards are filled with meanings and symbols based in truth, like the 4 suits being representative of the 4 seasons, or the 52 cards representing the number of weeks in the year, and the kings are all based on real rulers, and the King of Hearts represents the emotionally disturbed Charles VII of France. King Charles fell ill near the end of his life, and it was at this time that he became obsessed with numerology and playing cards, as he knew his face was already immortalized in their ink. He began to obsess over the fact that the king was the 13th card of any suit, and that it would bring him terrible misfortune. He started to see the number everywhere, and it eventually drove him mad. One day, one of his butlers went to the king's room to feed him, and found King Charles wielding a sword, proclaiming that the cards have shown me the truth of 13, and it's not meant for mortal eyes. And he then thrust the sword into the left side of his head, and it came out on the other side. His playing card was changed to depict the grisly way he died, and check for yourself. On many decks of cards, the King of Hearts has a sword in the left side of his head. It's even creepier that he chose to end his life on 7/6/1462, with 7 and 6 making 13, and the numbers of the year also adding up to 13. Makes you wonder if the number really did have some strange power. Number 7. The Cremation of Sam McGee. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake LaBarge where I cremated Sam McGee. This is the beginning of one of my most favorite poems of all time. Written by Robert W. Service, this creepy poem tells the story of 2 men who are on an Arctic expedition, and unfortunately, Sam passes away from the cold. The poem follows Sam's friend's journey, bringing his frozen dead body through the ice and snow to fulfill Sam's last wish, to be cremated, so that he could feel like he's warm and back at home in the South one last time. I won't spoil the rest, but I believe that there's enough of a story to make a movie here. To be following one man's struggle through the Arctic to see his friend's dying wish come true would be a pretty compelling film, not to mention the unexpected twists. Johnny Cash actually does a fantastic reading of it if you're so inclined to listen. Number 6. A Ride Home. Now, there are many different versions of this story, and some of them have been documented in real life by real people. One version is called The Witch of White Rock Lake. Another is called The Lady in White, but as the story goes, one night a woman was driving home after a long night shift, and due to some rain, the main road was out, so she needed to take a detour down an old dirt road that goes by the lake. As she's driving, she suddenly sees a woman in a white dress standing in the middle of the road. She stops the car, and as the woman in white approaches, she sees that they are absolutely drenched, head to toe. The woman comes to the window and, weeping, she asks for a ride home, saying that her boat capsized on the lake and that she needs to get home to her family. The driver says, "Of course, get in and tell me where you need to go." The lady in white gets in the back seat and gives her an address, it's not too far from where they are now, and they drive off into the night. After a little while, the driver asks for some clarification on the directions, but when she turns around, the woman is nowhere to be seen, but the seat is soaking wet. She decides to finish the journey to the address and arrives at a house. She knocks on the door and a man answers. She tells him about the woman in white and how she gave her this address and then disappeared. The man said, "You're the 5th person to knock on my door and tell me this story. 5 years ago tonight, my wife and I were sailing on the lake and we had a terrible accident and she drowned. She's been pleading for help ever since." Number 5, the 7th barn. Now, I think that this next one could be great on the silver screen, but not necessarily because of how scary it is, but because you could lean into the investigation angle and how obsession can drive people to do all sorts of crazy things. There was once a wealthy farmer who loved his wife so much that he bought her a heck of a lot of land as a wedding present. When they had a child, the husband decided to celebrate the occasion by building a barn and putting a plaque on it with their name. Every time the man and his wife had a child, he did this, and eventually they had 6 barns and 6 children, and they were happy. When his wife announced that she was pregnant again, he was overjoyed and began construction on the 7th barn, and the day that he finished, she went into labor. Unfortunately, his wife died in childbirth and so did their unborn son. Driven mad by grief and heartbreak, the man took the rest of his family out to the 7th barn to bury his wife and son, he told them. But then, he took an axe and killed all of them and hung himself from the rafters. They say if you visit the barn at night, you can see his ghostly figure hanging by his neck, blowing in the wind. And over the years, the land and barns were sold off, all but the 7th, as everyone knew of the tragedy that happened there. But a teacher told his son the scary story, and they decided to try to find the 7th barn. They scoured old maps, toured through the countryside and plains, and finally found what they thought was the 7th barn. It even had the nameplate on the outside, and they headed out there with a video camera to get some paranormal evidence. The next morning, the teacher's wife reported the son and husband missing, and the cops found their car abandoned on the side of the road near a barn. And when they looked inside, they saw their bodies hung by the neck from the rafters, blowing in the wind. Number 4, Knock. Now, making this next one into a feature-length film would be interesting, not necessarily because of the content, but for the lack thereof. This was published in 1948, written by an author named Frederick Brown, and it's not your normal ghost story, but the shortest horror story ever written. To make this a movie, I think you'd have to start long before the events take place and build the world up. It's only 2 sentences, and it goes like this. The last man on earth sat alone at the room. There was a knock on the door. Simple, short, and spooky. Number 3, Lick. One night, a young woman was home alone. Her roommates were out of town for the night, and she had the run of the place. She watched TV and ate junk food all evening, but when the night came, there was a terrible thunderstorm, and despite the fact that she should have grown out of it, she was still afraid of the dark, and the shadows, lightning, and noises in an empty house scared her half to death. Luckily, she had her faithful dog Spot to take care of her, and he curled up next to her on the bed and licked her hand to comfort her, and she fell asleep. In the middle of the night, she woke up to a noise, something that was dripping. Maybe some rain was leaking in, or a tap wasn't fully off, but she heard it loud and clear. Drip, drip, drip. The lightning and shadows and sounds scared her, but Spot licked her hand for comfort and she fell back asleep. An hour later, she woke up and heard the noise again. Drip, drip, drip. She wondered if she should go check on it, but she was too frightened from the shadows and the lightning. Spot licked her hand for comfort, and again she fell asleep. She woke 1 more hour later to the same noise. Drip, 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 and this time she gathered her courage and went to investigate. She followed the sound around her house until she realized it was coming from the bathroom, which she must have left the tap on. She opened the door and saw something horrible. Spot was hanging upside down from the shower rod, and he had been skinned. There was still some blood falling from his body, hitting the floor with a drip, drip, drip. Terrified, she ran back to her room to call the police, but inside she saw a note scrawled on the wall in blood, and it said, "Humans can lick too." As someone who grew up with a dog that slept on their bed, this one terrified me, and I'd like to see it on the big screen. Number 2, Red Ribbon. Now this one was probably one of my favorite horror stories growing up, as it was featured in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Although it was a green ribbon, I prefer it with red. I'm not sure if it's the scariest, but there's a lot of stuff that you could take from here to make a pretty compelling movie. Bill loved Sally with all of his heart, common name for horror stories I guess, but there was always something off about her. Even as he fiddled with the engagement ring in his pocket, he thought so. And every day, no matter what, she had a red ribbon tied around her neck. He proposed and she accepted, and later he asked about the ribbon, and she replied with, "Bill, I must never take off my red ribbon, and if you love me, you'll never ask me about it again." And he left it alone. Over the years, he bought her many beautiful outfits, but no matter what she was wearing, even on their wedding day, she wore the red ribbon tied neatly in a bow around her neck. And the question began to eat away at him. On their anniversary, he bought her a beautiful necklace, thinking that she would have to remove the ribbon to wear it, but when he went to remove it so he could put the necklace around her neck, she said, "The necklace is beautiful and she'll treasure it forever, but I must never take off my red ribbon." This angered him slightly, but he let it go. When their baby was born, it was the happiest moment of his life, but the question came back to him when the baby reached his hand towards the thing tied around its mother's neck, and Sally said sweetly to her new baby, "No. Mommy must never take off her red ribbon." Many nights later, the question he was never to ask had burrowed deep into his mind, and it was driving him mad. So while Sally was sleeping, he slowly reached over and pulled at both sides of the bow on the pretty red ribbon. And just as it finally came loose, Sally's eyes opened and her head rolled off of her neck and onto the floor. With a single tear rolling down her cheek, she cried, "I warned you." And finally, number 1, don't turn on the light. I think this one is so scary because for some reason it feels the most realistic, and I can already see the trailer in my head. Miranda and Lucy were roommates and went to school at the local college. One night Lucy comes home and tells Miranda that they've been invited to a big party and that they need to get ready to go. Miranda says she's not feeling well and that she's gonna have a nap on the couch instead. Lucy heads to the party, but halfway through her walk she realizes she's forgotten her keys. Classic Lucy. When she gets back to her apartment, she opens the very creaky door slowly so that she doesn't make too much noise. She can hear steady, slow breaths, so she decides to not turn on the light so she doesn't wake up her sleeping friend. She knows the place like the back of her hand, so it's no problem. She walks through the apartment in the dark, quietly, grabs her keys, and heads back out the door to the party. She dances all night, and later, exhausted, she walks back up the stairs to her apartment and sees the door wide open. She runs inside but can't see anything in the dark, so she flicks the switch on the wall, and when the room brightens, she sees Miranda, mangled and covered in blood in the middle of the floor. Lucy lets out a blood-curdling scream, and then she sees the mirror on the wall, and on it was a message scrawled in Miranda's blood, "Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the lights?"
Starting off this countdown, we have the cup of ramen noodles. Ever wanted to know what your ramen noodles look like before hot water and delicious seasoning is poured on top of it? Well, now you can. And now, how many of you feel like this is a scam? I thought the whole damn bottom half of the cup was filled, not just a portion of the cup. This literally should be illegal. That and only filling up chip bags halfway. Like, what's up with that? Seriously, I get that ramen is cheap and all, but at least give us poor people more noodles than that. Doubt companies are gonna be too thrilled now that we have learned about this. We're on to you. Moving on at number 9, we have the bloodless heart. So I'm sure all of us know what a human heart looks like, right? I mean, like out of the body. I mean, you should, or else that's kind of concerning. Like, don't you not pay attention in school? Anyways, this photo I'm about to show you is what a human heart looks like, completely drained of blood. And I am absolutely speechless. That is not what I was expecting. And honestly, it looks really pretty. Is that weird for me to say? I don't know. At first I was like, oh, that's a piece of raw chicken. And then I was like, oh, no, it's like quartz or a gemstone or something. No, it's a goddamn human heart. Mind blown. Coming in at number 8, we have the big lighters. So I was today years old when I found out that big lighters are just little lighters with an extended point. This literally feels like a scam. When you buy a bigger lighter, you're hoping to get more use out of it. But no, it's just a regular lighter, meaning it has the same amount of lighter fluid, meaning you're paying more and getting the same. I will say it's more handy because it's easier to use and helps me not burn my little fingies, but still, this feels illegal. Just goes to show that size doesn't matter, and don't judge a book by its cover or whatever people say, okay? My whole life is a lie now. Coming in at number 7, we have the turtle's mouth. Turtles are really freaking cute, right? And aside from snapping turtles, they're pretty slow and harmless creatures. I personally think turtles are so cute. But this next image completely changed my mind. So this image is the inside of a turtle's mouth. Yeah, you heard me. I have never seen anything that creepy before. I thought I was looking inside of an alien's mouth or something. But nope. Apparently the spikes help trap food to prevent it from coming out of their mouth. But that's why plastic is so dangerous for turtles. If they eat it and realize they can't digest it, it's hard for them to get rid of it because of these alien spikes. It often gets stuck on the spikes, which is really sad. But anyways, next time you see a turtle and you're like, oh my god, they're so cute and innocent, just remind yourself of the evil that lurks in their mouth. I also apologize for all you turtle lovers out there. Sorry. In our 6th spot, we have the unrecognizable objects. Pretty recently, this photo went viral on the internet. Why? Because it disturbed so many viewers. Take a look at this photo and tell me what you see. That's the thing. It's virtually impossible to identify any of the familiar objects. It's wild and leaves you feeling very unsettled. It's like you know what you're seeing, but your brain just can't comprehend it or put a name on it. According to Dr. Frank McAndrew, a psychology professor, he said, and I quote, "Trying to interpret an ambiguous image like this sparks uncertainty, which can lead to feeling creeped out. When a person is unsure if something could be harmful, it's normal to experience a sense of unease. We also can get creeped out by confusing things that press competing buttons in our brain, making it hard for us to categorize or understand what we are looking at." So, there you go. That's why this image is freaking everyone out. I just wish that the poster would come forward and tell us what the hell we're looking at. Like, what is it? I'm not okay. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the Flesh Lego Man. So I ruined turtles for you, now it's time to ruin Lego for you, yay! Now what the actual hell is this? Someone decided to make a flesh Lego man? I am deeply disturbed and I have so many questions. The first one being why, the second one being why, and the third being why. So this was created with the help of special effects makeup artist Frank Ippolito and the team at Tested.com. They decided to dress a man up as this terrifying Lego real-life fleshy man and have him hang out at the San Diego Comic-Con. But honestly, we still don't know why they did this, besides wanting to terrify children and make it so I never sleep again. I honestly think the worst part are its hands. It's got Lego claw hands, but has a freaking nasty fingernail. That's a no from me. Coming in at number 4, we have the doll. In 2018, at Cat Scotlu on Twitter tweeted a picture of this photo and it quickly spread like wildfire. This is a picture of a doll whose face has been removed and then replaced with another doll's face. And apparently this was the works of her little sister, who a lot of people are now concerned for. Apparently she is obsessed with doing this. She has also done this with stuffed animals as well, which is very concerning. That's some Norman Bates, Buffalo Bill, Ed Gein behavior right there. I'd run if I was her. Next thing you know, she's performing these surgeries on real people. Moving on to number 3, we have Feetloaf. And yes, it's as bad as it sounds. Some deranged person decided to, instead of making a traditional meatloaf, to take the meat and form it into a person's foot. The worst part is the onions for the toenails. Okay, so 10 out of 10 for creativity and the name, negative 100 out of 10 for doing this though. I'm sure when it was cooked though, it changed its shape and didn't look as bad, but this is something I just did not need to see today. In fact, meatloaf is bad enough as is, making it into feet isn't going to make it more enjoyable to eat. Moving on to number 2, we have the unknown figure. This is one image that I wish I could erase from my mind completely. It features an individual hunched over while on their tippy toes and fingers, wearing this creepy mask. What's even scarier is that I have no clue where this image came from. I tried reverse image searching and just found a lot of blogs/posts talking about it, but no one actually knows who posted it or took it or why. This is the definition of a cursed image. So if any of you know the backstory to this photo, please let me know in the comments below so it can stop cursing my sleep. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Antran. While finding pictures for this video, I stumbled upon this nightmarish one. It features a skinny, creepy robot alongside 2 kids. Obviously, I was curious about learning more in hopes to find the origin of this photo and if the robot went on to kill a number of people, but all that popped up was a creepypasta called Antran. The creepypasta goes as so. According to the narrator of the creepypasta, this photo was taken in the 70s and features their son on the left with their robot Antran, who they adopted into their family. This is also the only remaining image they have of their son. So they found this robot at a garbage dump. Someone had tried to throw him away. I wonder why. But they were amazed, so they took him home. In the end, Antran turns evil, torments the family, and eventually kidnaps the son. Now, of course, this is just a creepypasta, but it's wild how I can't even find the source of this image. A lot of people are in the same boat as me. They have been searching for years to no avail. The image is creepy enough on its own. It's even creepier not knowing the photo's backstory. Alright guys, that's all for today's video. Let me know in the comments below which one of these photos creeped you out the most. Honestly, the turtle? Never expected that. And I just, ugh. Oh, no thanks.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the Rhode Island vampire. Admittedly, witch and vampire hunts aren't exactly a topic covered in most history classes, but this is truly a pretty crazy story. In the late 1800s, tuberculosis was spreading pretty rapidly in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont. This obviously would have been pretty terrifying for the residents of these places, but things quickly took a very dark turn. Since many of the people who were passing away from this illness appeared very obviously ill with sunken, drained faces, for some reason, the logical response was that people believed that they had been the prey of vampires. There was a family in Exeter, Rhode Island that had multiple people pass away from the illness, so some people believed that someone in this family must be the feeding vampire. They even went as far as to exhume the bodies of some of the deceased family members to make sure that they weren't undead. One of the exhumed bodies had passed away more recently, so her body was in better condition, which people of course took as a sign of her being a vampire. This led to them burning her heart and liver, and then they mixed the ashes with water. This is most definitely a crime today and pretty scary, but to make things even worse, they gave this concoction to other people in the town who had fallen ill as some kind of a cure. Imagine having to drink that and then still having tuberculosis after. Definitely not a good trade-off. In our number 9 spot today, we have India and World War II. It would be shocking to hear of a school not teaching anything about World War II, but it's often that we don't truly get the full scope of what went on. One thing I saw brought up a few times was the role that India played in the war and what they went through. Firstly, if you didn't know, India played a huge part in the Second World War. We normally hear of the large death tolls from such as the 418,000 Americans who died, or the 450,000 people from the UK, which, don't get me wrong, is a huge and terrible number. But it is estimated that 3 million Indian people died in World War II, which is something I have literally never heard of anyone talk about before. India was fighting Japan, which for the record also had an extremely high death toll in this war, on the Eastern Front, and they were fighting Germany on the Western. World War II is a part of our global history, so why don't we talk about it and how it affected all of the countries? In our number 8 spot today, we have the Acadian expulsion. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far. This is something that happened in my own country, you guys, and I can honestly say this was never taught at the schools I attended. The Acadians were descendants of the 17th and 18th century French settlers who settled in the area that is now the Canadian Maritimes, so New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. In 1730, Acadians had to swear to British authorities that they would remain neutral on any conflict between Britain and France. Basically, one thing led to another, and the governor of Nova Scotia at the time, Charles Lawrence, saw the Acadians as some kind of a threat, and he also wondered why people who weren't from the area were allowed to live on such a beautiful part of the land. Well, isn't that real rich coming from someone who also wasn't from the area? But that is a whole separate conversation. Charles tried to force the Acadians to take an unqualified oath of allegiance to Britain, and when they refused, he imprisoned them and then ordered them to be deported. A man from New England called Charles Morris came up with the disgusting idea to surround the Acadian churches on a Sunday morning and capture as many people as possible while also burning their houses and crops. This whole situation led to approximately 10,000 Acadians being deported, and apparently this whole ordeal had a fatality rate of 53% for the Acadians. This whole thing is honestly pretty disgraceful, and it's just something that we don't talk about. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Iranian Revolution of 1979. On August 19th, 1978, at the Cinema Rex in Abadan, Iran, there were hundreds of people watching a film when 4 men barricaded the doors, doused the cinema in gasoline, and lit the whole thing ablaze. This was a key event that led to the following revolution of 1979, but it truthfully had been building for quite some time, and this obviously wasn't the only event that led to this movement. This revolution was unique in the fact that it lacked a lot of the usual causes, such as a defeat in war, or a gigantic national debt, or an uprising of those in poverty. There is a lot that happened and a lot that went into this revolution, and I truly do not have time to cover in this video even half of it. But this revolution not only toppled Iran's absolute monarch, but it had worldwide political repercussions that are still seen today. In our number 6 spot today, we have Cyrus the Great. It is entirely possible that you may have learned about Cyrus the Great in school, as he was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, but there is one thing he did that apparently a lot of us didn't know that possibly changed the course of our history. After he took Babylon over, he freed all of the captured slaves in the city and let them go back to their homelands. This included the Hebrews who were captured and enslaved from Judea. This may seem like a nice and reasonable thing to do, but it truly was more than that. By allowing these people to be free and return to their homes and continue practicing their religions, this may have been what has kept some religions alive. Without this move, it is possible that we may not have Judaism, Christianity, or Islam today, and that would have made our entire history very, very different. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Italian Renaissance dark side. When we think of the Italian Renaissance period, it is known for development and the rebirth that it caused, which makes a lot of sense considering the word Renaissance literally means rebirth. But there is one less glamorous and slightly frightening side to this period that isn't widely talked about. Sailors who had been returning from the New World at this point brought something less than lovely back with them, and that was syphilis, which spread through an entire French army. After this, the troops brought what was called the Great Pox to the rest of Europe. Since there was no penicillin or banana medicine back then, the disease spread rapidly and the symptoms were pretty gruesome. It would often happen that a person who had fallen ill would have the skin on their faces essentially be rotting away, which would leave large ulcers. Some people's noses and lips would be pretty much gone, and it happened often that people would sadly pass away from the disease. So basically what we think of as a beautiful time in Europe was both world-changing, but also very scary, and pretty close to a zombie apocalypse. In our number 4 spot today, we have the history of dentures. I suppose this one is less of an event and more of a weird practice, but I just had to include it. I don't have a ton of experience with dentures, but they seem to be a pretty straightforward thing these days, aside from the cost of dental, but things weren't always the way they are today. Instead of dentures being made of fake teeth, before they used to be made with real human teeth, which is absolutely disgusting to me. After the Battle of Waterloo, scavengers went and took the teeth off of the corpses, which is quite a job, and then they sold these teeth to dentists. These dentists would boil the teeth, chop the roots off, and then attach these teeth to ivory base plates and then sell them to the customers. Aside from this being an extremely morally questionable practice in its entirety, it is also just so creepy. In our number 3 spot today, we have telephone cats. If you're a cat person, you might want to skip over this number. In 1929, 2 scientists at Princeton University wanted to conduct an experiment in order to test how auditory nerves perceive sounds. This is obviously extremely important research, but the way they went about this is truly messed up. They took a sedated but alive cat and cut out a part of its brain. They then attached one end of a telephone wire to the cat's auditory nerve and then the other end to a telephone receiver. When one of these scientists spoke into the cat's ear, the other one could hear it on the other end. This is cool, but most definitely not an excuse to do something so inhumane. There were, of course, benefits to this experiment, and it is believed that this may have helped lead to the development of cochlear implants, which is, of course, an incredibly important scientific advancement. The worst part, however, while the cat actually survived this experiment, instead of treating it like a king for the rest of its life like it truly deserved, these scientists instead decided to kill it to see if the experiment would still work on a dead cat. It didn't. In our number 2 spot today, we have the smallpox pandemic. I'm sure at some point or another, most of us learned about smallpox and the epidemic, which is something that we luckily don't really have to worry about much anymore. But one thing a lot of people explained that they didn't know was how badly it devastated indigenous peoples. Europeans who came over to America brought with them a multitude of diseases that they would have had some immunity to, considering it was likely their bodies had encountered it before. But this was not the case for those already living on the land that is now referred to as North America. Indigenous Americans not only had no immunity towards this disease, but also their traditional ways of treating illness may have only exacerbated the symptoms. Because of course, how could you possibly know how to treat something that you've never seen before and with no help from the people who actually do know? It has been estimated that the spread of this disease caused the population of Indigenous Americans to decline by 70%. That is absolutely insane. There's a theory that this spread of disease may have been one of the only things that led to the colonization of North America. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Tulsa Massacre. This is one that many people, including people from Tulsa, explained that they didn't really learn much about in school. This event occurred on May 31st and June 1st of 1921, and it has actually been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. This happened in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and basically just mobs of white racist people went out and attacked black residents and businesses. What started this was when a 19-year-old black man named Dick Rowland was accused of harming a 17-year-old white girl, and he was subsequently arrested, and there were rumors that he was going to be lynched. This of course drew a bunch of racist white people out of their homes to participate, but then a group of around 75 black men also showed up to make sure that he didn't get lynched. One thing led to another, and a firefight broke out that led to 10 of the white people and 2 of the black people being killed. After this, all hell broke loose. Just last year, the last living survivor of the massacre, R&B and jazz saxophonist Hal Singer, passed away at the age of 100. And just last year, this massacre finally became a part of the Oklahoma State curriculum, and it's about time. Only a century too late. I also feel like in that I didn't include, but I should have said, that thing after the lynching was like only the beginning of it, and then everything got crazy and way more people died, and it was really destructive. I just didn't want anyone to think that I was making it seem like it wasn't as bad as it was, because it really was.
Number 10, the 1904 Olympic Marathon. The 1904 Olympic Marathon probably had some of the most interesting competitors ever. It wasn't just one person who made this race bizarre, but a whole handful of people and strange circumstances. First off, the course was just absolutely covered in dust, and breathing it in caused a bunch of the runners to suffer severe internal injuries. So right off the bat, the race just totally sucked. The man who finished the race in first place got some bad cramps and decided he was just gonna hitch a ride in a car. Then he got out near the finish line and ran across. The guy who came in second place was given a mixture of different foods and chemicals, which were actually a poison used to kill rodents, but they were trying to use it as like a steroid to make him a better runner, and instead his crew ended up carrying him across the finish line. The guy who came fourth gambled all his money when he got to the United States and ended up having to wear full dress clothing to the race, using a knife to cut his pants into shorts. He then ate some apples during the race, got sick, and took a nap, but still came fourth. Number 9, Robert Liston surgery. We all know that medical practices throughout history were a bit dodgy, and they didn't have a lot of the comforts that we have today. A man named Robert Liston was known as one of the fastest surgeons in the 1800s, and you had to be fast because they didn't have anesthesia, so surgery basically sucked for everybody involved. Liston also became the only person to perform a surgery with a 300% mortality rate. He was performing a leg amputation surgery, but worked so fast he accidentally cut off 2 of his assistant's fingers. Both the patient and the assistant died of infection because the saw he used was dirty. The third death occurred when, during the procedure, Liston accidentally sliced a nearby doctor's coat. But just the coat. The doctor thought he had been cut open, went into shock, and died of a heart attack, leading to 3 people dying during an operation meant to just save 1 person. Number 8, Salem tomato trial. We're all well aware of the Salem witch trials, but you've probably never heard of the Salem tomato trials. In the early 1800s, tomatoes were put on trial in Salem, New Jersey because they were believed to be poisonous. The tomato was also considered a sinful fruit because it can act as a mild aphrodisiac. Only one man in the town defended tomatoes during the trial and even tried to bring about tomato growing competitions so people would be less afraid. He would also regularly eat them in front of everybody, leading most people to think he was completely insane. Growing annoyed with the trial and fear of tomatoes, he decided to walk in front of the courthouse with an entire basket of tomatoes in his hands. He then proceeded to eat the entire pile of tomatoes as a crowd gathered around and watched, and to their shock, the man did not immediately die. This was enough to finally convince people that tomatoes were not evil. Number 7. Wojtek. During the Second World War, the Polish army recruited one of the most unique soldiers ever, a bear named Wojtek, and based on the soldier's accounts, he was actually pretty damn cool. The Polish soldiers found the bear cub by the side of a road, his mother apparently having been killed by hunters. So the soldiers took him in and raised him, and a civilian refugee even helped to train the animal. In order to get him on a British transport ship, he was officially enlisted as a Polish soldier, being given a paybook, serial number, and the rank of private. He would apparently sleep in the bunks with the other soldiers and was also a huge fan of beer and cigarettes. He also would do actual work for the army, helping to transport supplies and carry heavy boxes of ammunition. After the war, he was relocated to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he lived out the rest of his days, passing away at the age of 21. The average lifespan of a bear is 20 to 30 years, so that's really not bad for a guy raised on beer and cigarettes. Number 6. Nuclear war. Did you know that we were probably a lot closer to nuclear war than we thought? Back during the Cold War in the 80s, everyone was preparing for oncoming nuclear conflict, building bunkers and hiding resources in the case of having to regrow a barren landscape. This didn't happen, and it was later revealed that we were saved from this outcome by a single man. In 1983, a freak accident where sunlight reflected off high altitude clouds caused a Soviet satellite system to indicate that there were 5 incoming missiles, which they of course assumed to be coming from the American military. A lieutenant colonel by the name of Stanislav reasoned that if the United States were actually starting a nuclear war, it would be a full attack and not just 5 missiles. So he called it a false alarm and, against his orders, refused to initiate their own nuclear launch out of retaliation. Number 5. New Atlantis. In 1964, Ernest Hemingway's younger brother named Lester sailed out to international waters near Jamaica and started his own country. Yeah, he sailed a barge made out of bamboo that was about 8 by 30 feet and declared it a micronation that was half independent and half part of the United States. So how did he manage to do that? He discovered an obscure law called the Guano Islands Act of 1856, which says that US citizens can claim ownership of unclaimed islands that had guano deposits, which, if you're not aware, is bird and bat. He claimed his new nation to be called New Atlantis and even wrote a new constitution for it, though this constitution was actually just the United States Constitution, with every mention of the United States being changed to New Atlantis. The plan was to use this as a publicity stunt to raise money and use the raft as a research facility. Unfortunately, New Atlantis was wrecked by a tropical storm just 2 years after it was constructed. Number 4. The War on Cats. Pope Gregory IX lived from 1145 to 1241 and became the Pope when he was already over 80 years old. He had a history as a lawyer and was known for putting a few different motions through during his time as head of the church. Unfortunately for cat lovers, Gregory was a bit of a red flag because he was apparently more of a dog person. He put forward the first ever church documents that condemned black cats as being instruments of Satan, effectively starting the war on cats and placing a target on the head of every black cat in the area. Shortly after Gregory's time, the Black Death came about thanks to diseased rats spreading the infection all over the place and leading to a lot of people living during that era having a pretty bad time. Some people blame the Black Death on Gregory's war on cats because they say, due to the reduced cat population, the rat population inflated, so they were just running around willy-nilly spreading disease. Number 3. The Siege of Weinsberg. Weinsberg is a town near the southwest part of Germany. The name of the castle that sits above the town roughly translates to Women's Faithfulness Castle. So why is that? In the year 1140, King Conrad III defeated the Duke of Welf and placed the town of Weinsberg under siege. The women negotiated a surrender that held the terms that they would be allowed to leave the town unharmed with whatever they could carry on their shoulders. Conrad probably thought that they were just gonna take their children, clothes, food, maybe a goat. What he didn't expect was for all the women of the town to take their husbands and other men upon their shoulders and carry them out of town. The king's people were like, yo dude, they can't do that, but the king was like, nah, that's actually kind of valid, and let it happen, saying a king should always stand by his word. Number 2, astronomer's pet moose. A 16th century astronomer who discovered the supernova was known not only for that, but also for just being a bit of a bizarre guy. A few of his odd behaviors included losing his nose in a duel, keeping a jester/clairvoyant in his house, and having a pet moose. The pet moose was apparently just as bizarre as he was. The moose apparently lived in the castle with him and would walk alongside him like a loyal dog, and apparently also had an unquenchable thirst for Danish beer. Him and his pet became extremely popular, and they would often be invited to dinner parties together to show off the moose's tame behavior. Unfortunately, the moose's alcoholism got out of control at one of these dinner parties, and he had a bit too much to drink. He chugged beers with noblemen until he managed to stumble up a set of stairs in the castle before falling off and passing away. Number 1, the latrine disaster of 1184. German noblemen during the Roman Empire would often meet to have discussions over land disputes and try to find some temporary peace. King Henry VI called for a meeting over a dispute which would take place in the Church of St. Peter in Erfurt. They all gathered in a room that was directly above the building's toilet pit. The weight of all the people on the floor, add to that their heavy chain clothing, caused the floor to collapse, and they all fell into the pit below. Between 60 and 100 of the people gathered there ended up passing away in the human waste, whether it be from drowning or being crushed by the floor. One of the deaths was Count Heinrich of Schwarzburg, who had previously joked he would perish in his own shit if he ever failed his title.
Number 10, boiling. Yeah, throwback to the Middle Ages when we would boil people. Awesome. Any Game of Thrones fans out there? Some of this is too accurate. In 1531, the time King Henry VIII was unfortunately running the show, they made boiling a capital punishment. Say no more. I'm never breaking the law, ever. Not even thinking about it. Poisoning somebody back then was equal to treason, obviously. Therefore, it was agreed that you should be boiled, slowly, might I add, if you were caught tampering with a royal's beverage, their IPA. You know what I mean? You drop a little bit of something in there, you're out. You're getting boiled. That's horrible. That's the worst thing I've heard today. Number 9, the Battle of Zappolino. Turning the calendars back a little further, this time to 1325, the Battle of Zappolino was a large-scale event over a bucket. Yeah, I wish I was joking. War of the Oaken Bucket, that's also what it's referred to as. This beef was between two Italian towns, Bologna and Modena. It all kicked off when soldiers from Modena snuck into Bologna with intentions to steal. What are they gonna steal? Are they gonna steal the Declaration of Independence? No, they're gonna steal a wooden bucket from the city's well, because, you know, resources were quite sparse back then. If you steal a bucket, that's equivalent to stealing, you know, something big. That's like a pretty big heist back then. The Bolognese declared war then, obviously, and then sent in an invading force of 30,000 foot soldiers, as well as 2,000 cavaliers. The city of Modena had a smaller army. They only had 500 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalry forces. Thing is, these guys, they still won. Yeah, even though they had the lower force, they still got it. These guys chased the larger army way back to Bologna while destroying every town in the process. Now, some recall them bringing the bucket back just to taunt the city, which is pretty horrible, but I'm like, yeah, you know what? I kind of would too. I don't know. The bucket is currently on display still in Modena, so if you want to go see it, there you go. Go grab the kids and the wife. Say, hey, we're going on a trip. We're gonna go see a bucket. Yeah, bright and early. Number 8, the hottest wedding in town. It's January 28th, 1393, and you are formally invited to a masquerade ball. Oh, how lucky are you? Let's do this. The French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria is hosting one of the most lavish parties of the decade. When the French royal court was celebrating the marriage of one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, it was a big deal, right? It was a happy day. For some, the best day of their lives. For others at this ball, not so great. King Charles VI, he had 5 companions perform a dance, this, you know, theater routine. They did a performance dressed as beasts. They were committed to the bit, I'll add. They had masks, they had big baggy outfits, lots of linen, and lots of stuffing to appear as if they were real beasts. Good stuff, right? So far, we're having a great time, a dazzling time. The party was going well, wine was spilling, beasts were roaring, but one rule was put into place before this party even started. Absolutely, positively, no candles. Yeah, what an obvious fire hazard that would be, right? Well, the Duke of Orleans, he had a little too much fun prior to this event, and he forgot the first rule of Fire Club when he arrived. The guy walked in with a lit torch. Some accounts say that he dropped the torch by accident, others say that he got too close, trying to guess the identity of one of the beasts. Either way, flames were spread fast, and this tragic event took the lives of 4 people in total. total. Hence the name you may have recognized, Ball of the Burning Men. Number 7. Medieval pub night. Okay, it's almost the weekend now. We're starting to get ready to see friends, maybe hit up the local pub. Now, imagine for a second that it's the 14th century. What are we doing, right? You and your friend decide to hit the big city, the big medieval city, right? Check out one of those hot new medieval taverns that every peasant from the north keeps talking about. Now, you can't get an Uber quite yet, so instead, here's what you should expect. For starters, unless you somehow had a horse in the 14th century, bravo, it's like having a Tesla. Nice, must be nice. You were walking quite a ways just to get to the tavern. And if the commute didn't kill you, the disease waiting in the city probably would. Living in the medieval city was horrible. It was isolated, it was dirty, it was filled with rats, crime, strict curfews had to be put into place, violent crimes would happen all night long. Number 6. Roman punishments. This was a form of capital punishment used, of course, in ancient Rome, and also used in the Middle Ages as well, but its origins go back quite a ways. Yeah, metal would be heated up in a cauldron for a very long time, just hot metal, to the point where it was molten, just a soup of minerals. And at that point, they would pour said molten mineral soup down the throat of the accused. Yeah, this is why you don't break the law in the Dark Ages. Say no more. This was for the worst of the worst, obviously. It was execution by molten metal. It was supposedly done to wealthy Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus back in ancient Rome. So yeah, like I said, the OGs go way back. The metal would burn your muscle inside, literally cooking it from the inside out, and after a few moments, of course, it would harden and you would, yeah, horrible? I agree. Let's hit that thumbs up, get the karma back up, get that energy back up, and let's move on. Number 5. Plague rats. Yeah, just kidding, it's all disgusting. Say we go to the medieval pub, right? Say we beat the odds and we arrive. That's a feat in itself. We reserved a table, we're in, now you're with your friends and family, drinking ale, having a great time. Well, it'd be a shame if, say, hundreds of rats started to swarm your feet out of nowhere, right? That'd be pretty mildly uncomfortable while you're trying to eat some soup. Yeah, the plague rolled, or rather crawled, into town back in 1328, and it lasted until 1350. And it was actually horrible. It was so bad. We think of our own plague here in history and we compare it, and I'll tell you one thing. I never saw any swarms of black rats attacking anyone's feet. Didn't see that once over the past few years. By 1530, the European population was reduced by 1/3, and rats were almost entirely to blame. These hairy balls of disease, they passed it on to everybody. They didn't have public transit back then, right? We weren't sharing offices, we weren't spreading disease that way. It was rats running rampant just under your feet. That's disgusting. Number 4. Combat of the 30. Now this battle was arranged beforehand, right? It was bring your shiniest armor and your most golden gal and arrive fancy looking and meet us at the battlefield in Brittany. Both sides got to pick 30 champions each. They had to pick the best knights in all of their land, all to battle each other. One side represents the King of England, the other France. Now this whole thing was arranged by a captain in the French banner named Jean de Beaumanoir. Now this event pulled in a crowd, drinks were served throughout said crowd, and this fight lasted a very long time. Again, it was entertainment. Hours went by and 4 French knights had fallen as well as 2 Englishmen. So they took breaks. It was like a sporting event, really. And by the end of the whole thing, the English ended up surrendering after losing 9 knights, and the French in total lost 6. Number 3, Bacchanalia. Have you ever dreamt of joining an ancient Roman wine cult? Me neither. But in the 2nd century BC, it would have been a perfect time to maybe go and try it out. Ancient Romans, what they would do back then, they would gather in these cultic celebrations, all in the name of Bacchus, the wine god, right? Of course, let's all meet and get naked and drink wine. These gatherings would be held in private, thank God, or quiet areas of the woods. A little creepy, imagine bumping into that. And what they would do is they would dance, they would cook food, eat, drink some more, maybe drink a little too much, and then things would get a little sweaty. They would get a little intimate, if you know what I'm saying. That was the whole point of this Roman cult. You'd gather in small homes to dance the night away, you could say. Some accounts say people would often get poisoned in these ancient wine parties, so by time 186 rolled around, the Roman Senate voted to end these cult gatherings entirely. Number 2, a lot of cheese. 1837, President Andrew Jackson, he knew this, okay? He was ahead of the game. He knew cheese was the main event, so during his last White House party as president, officially, he ordered a 1,500-pound brick of cheese. Then he invited 10,000 of his closest friends, who I hope weren't lactose intolerant, and they all went to town. They made history that day, literally. To move such a unit of cheese to the White House from New York, let's talk about that. Here we go. Officials had to use 24 horses just to move this thing, and it had to sit for 2 years before they could even open it up and dive in. Prepared for for 2 years and gone in 2 hours. And finally, number 1, pleasures of the Enchanted Isle. If you think Elon Musk is wasting time and resources, you should have seen King Louis XIV. What a mess. Back in May 1664, King Louis XIV decided to throw a big celebration for his mistress. He told all invited that the party was for his mother, but really the spotlight was on his lady the entire time. How mean is that, right? Already you're like, ugh, what a diva this guy is. This party though, it was a week long. How exhausting is that? Louis went above and beyond to keep the party going. He had fun outfits, a massive fake palace, a big float that looked like a whale, because that's fun, I guess. And of course, to cap it all off, a ballet show, just to finish the week-long festival. And while setting off fireworks on day 7, however, the fake palace caught real fire. And at that point, everybody was ordered to go home.
In our number 10 spot, we have the mosquito experiment. This experiment is truly the most surprising one to me on this list. I cannot believe how many people don't know about this. Apparently, in 1956 and 1957, the US Army conducted a series of experiments on Georgia, Florida, and Savannah, where millions of infected mosquitoes were released into the public in order to see if insects could spread yellow fever. The result? Well, they learned that indeed they can. Of course, at the expense of the American people's health, as many died, many developed fevers, respiratory problems, stillbirths, and so much more. Allegedly, researchers posed as public health workers and asked people if they needed help in order to get close to them and observe them. Pretty evil in my opinion, and makes you wonder and hope that nothing like that is happening to us right now, but possibly at this moment in time, we are not aware of it. If you're liking this video so far, don't forget to smash that like button, as it will really help us out. In our number 9 spot, we have the Black Death. The Black Death is definitely one of the craziest events in history that is definitely taught about in some schools, but as this was so long ago, it's not as frequently spoken about like World War I and II, for example. It is also known by its other labels, the Great Plague or the Black Plague. And as you can tell by the title, it was a horrible widespread pandemic that killed from 75 to 200 million people. They say at least half of Europe at the time. It took place in 1346 to 1353. As you can imagine, such a plague during a time where no one could stay indoors and communicate online, there was mass chaos everywhere. People blamed religion, witchcraft, and anything they could blame. There's a very famous painting by the name of The Triumph of Death by Peter Bruegel that is supposed to be depicting the chaos of that time. There is so much death and things on fire, the painting is truly haunting to look at. In our number 8 spot, we have government testing. In 1954, the US government performed a series of nuclear tests in the Pacific Ocean called Castle Bravo, and the explosion occurred a little too close to the Marshall Islands, and it heavily impacted the people there. The Marshallese people had radiation poisoning, beta burns, and of course, as you can imagine, many developed cancer. After this event, the US created a new project called Project 4.1, where they examined and studied the after effects of the explosion on the Marshallese people, and many wondered, was the explosion perhaps on purpose so that the US could study the effects on these people? Now that would be a truly horrific thing if proven to be true, not that anyone would ever be able to find that out, but regardless, why don't more people know about this very serious event in history? I bet you the Marshallese people are still dealing with after effects. In our number 7 spot, we have the Nanking Massacre. The Nanking Massacre took place in 1937 to 1938, and even though it was only 1 year, a significant amount of damage was done. This was a time when the Japanese Imperial Army invaded Nanjing, China, and a series of killings and many other brutal forms of torture took place. It has been estimated that over 300,000 died, and the women were ordered to do unspeakable things to their offspring. It's quite horrific, so I cannot go into detail, otherwise YouTube will censor the video, but it's wild to me that not many know about this horrible event in history. In our number 6 spot, we have the Great Leap Forward. In Canada, we are taught a little bit about world history and then our own Canadian history, but I was never taught about this catastrophe, so I thought I would include it in this list. If you were taught this, then that's good, because this is definitely an event that everyone needs to know about. Between 1958 to 1962, a policy was put in place implemented by Mao Zedong, who was the chairman of the Communist Party in China, and this policy led to the death of up to 45 million people. How was this policy even implemented? Well, under the disguise of distributing the wealth and making everyone equal as a sort of utopian paradise, so that their country could surpass their competitors. But this quickly turned into people not being given food, which led to a projected 25 million dying of starvation, and when incentives to work were removed, removed, violence was used to motivate people. Oh, and did I mention that food was only given to those that followed the party's every order? Pretty horrific and crazy to think that my mom and dad were alive when this happened. It was not that long ago. In our number 5 spot, we have the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion, also known as the Taiping Civil War in 1850, was a massive civil war that took place in China. The French, British, and American mercenaries were all involved. The country had suffered some major disasters, natural and economic, before the rebellion began, so as you can imagine, they were quite vulnerable. Also, apparently the Europeans brought an opium addiction to China. At the time, the Qing dynasty ruled China, and during this period, in comes a man named Hong Zhuang, who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. This war lasted till August of 1871. It is known as one of the bloodiest civil wars in history, killing 20 million people. In our number 4 spot, we have 2 heads. This is one of the most evil things on this list, and for anyone that likes dogs, this one may break your heart. This was a Russian scientist in the 50s by the name of Vladimir Demikov, and he ended up being the founder of human organ transplants, which arguably is one of the greatest discoveries in the last 100 years. The amount of lives this discovery has saved is probably unfathomable. So to think that before this discovery, the same doctor was performing head transplants on dogs for fun for 5 years, it's just so hard to believe. In our number 3 spot, we have amusement park deaths. A lot of people don't realize this, but many amusement parks around the world have had tragedies. Ironically, because these are places you would hope to go to feel joy, not sadness. Lake Shawnee Amusement Park is one example of a park that experienced one too many tragedies. The park was located in West Virginia from 1926 to 1966, and it had quite a few deaths on its hands while it was active. People believe that the land was cursed though, because before the park opened in 1783, many young European settlers were killed on the grounds by the natives in that area because the grounds were already a sacred burial area for them before the new settlers took over the land. People believe that all of the bloodshed left a mark on the energy of the area, and that is why the park never had a chance. In our number 2 spot, we have the Soviet deaths. Here we have yet another event where the government has put policies into place under the cause of making the country more economically and socially competitive, but yet the people suffer tremendously because of it. From 1917 to 1953, under the Soviet Union, approximately 49 million Russians died from a combination of revolution, starvation, and the forced resettlement, similar to the Great Leap Forward policy. Apparently, this initiative was due to one man, Joseph Stalin. It has been said that this desire to build a new and better country at any cost and to keep his power is the direct reason for all of these deaths. In our number 1 spot, we have the Mongolian conquests. This is something people certainly know a little bit about, but perhaps not the extent of it. Certainly those of us in North America are not taught much, but that's probably because it didn't take place here and there's just so much history to learn. The Mongol Empire was one of the largest in the world, covering 16% of the earth at one point. It was run by Genghis Khan, a man who is said to have more blood on his hands than anyone in history. Approximately 60 million died under his ruling, and also many women were severely harmed during this time by the men, and it is said that Genghis Khan alone may have reproduced a ton of children, as people say that he had about 500 secondary wives. Yikes.